So, and I
Beautiful.
think we'll probably maybe do like 30 to 40 minutes, just as however long we get carried away. So
Beautiful,
so, okay.
beautiful.
So hi everyone. I am Ashley from This Our Daily Life, and today with me I have Ben Shields. He's actually from The Right Media. He has a YouTube channel. How long have you been running that thing?
A little over 2 years at this
Okay,
point.
yeah. So, is it kind of weird to like be on the channel that you watch?
It is. It is. It definitely is.
I always think that was
surreal.
yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, you know. But so today what we're going to be talking about is poetry in particular. You guys know that I'm pretty passionate about poetry. I read a lot of it. And I wanted to ask you, Ben, just like when did you start writing poetry? What got you into it? And what's your favorite style so far?
Well, I think that I started getting into poetry around the time when I started getting more into philosophy.
Okay.
And I think that the philosophy, getting into that, it was more of a calling almost. Like I felt like there was more that I needed to understand that I didn't really see before.
Yeah.
And so as I started to read more philosophy, I realized that a lot of philosophy is really pretty poetic on its own. Like even though it's not written as poetry.
Yeah.
And I think that there's also a lot of philosophy that you can write and fit into poetry.
Yes.
And so it was a pretty natural progression. You know, I started, I spent about a year to a year and a half just reading philosophy and thinking for myself.
Okay.
And then I went into more of the poetry side of things when I realized that the words that I was using to describe certain things, it just wasn't enough. And I needed to spend more time like really cherry picking my words and making sure that when I'm saying something, it's as accurate as it can be. And it's like we were talking about the other day with the basket of words and how it's like over time people have like just started pulling words out, and so now it's like we've gotten to a point where people have less words to pull from in their mind, so it's quite literally like there are concepts they just don't understand because they don't have words to describe them.
Yeah.
And that's a little side note. That's why I think German is so interesting, because they have
Yes,
single words
yes.
that wrap insane concepts together.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I started getting more into the language side of things, and that pretty much lent itself, mixed with the philosophy, into poetry. When I realized that it was easier to wrap whole concepts into one sentence if you use the right words.
Yes. Yeah. And so you are something of a philologist then, which is like just the study, you know, like someone who studies words.
Yes.
And so like this is kind of a side question, but like have you read Lord of the Rings, and have you read any of like Tolkien's work? And
I have not read Tolkien.
Oh,
no.
Gosh, you would love him, because that's like all
What's your
he
draw
did.
to him?
Well, so he and have you watched Lord of the Rings at all?
I've seen 2 of the movies.
Okay, so his overarching story is very archetypal, and I love it for that reason. It has like just a really good clear, it's a good clear fairy tale that is good enough for adults to like, you know, pay attention to. And I think all fairy tales are important, but I think some of them, you know, like, you know, you kind of tune out if they're not interesting. But this is intriguing enough to get adults' attention. But he like really created cultures in his story, which is now why everyone is obsessed with doing that in their own stories. And I'm like, oh, just do your own thing. Don't try to copy somebody else. But he actually created his own language. So he literally created the language of Elvish, and it's like he has grammar, syntax, I mean everything. It's crazy.
Wow.
So, but he was also a philologist and someone who really paid attention to words, very like just was really into what does a word really mean. And so I find people that pay attention to that kind of detail. He wrote like really good poetry and stuff. There's a lot of poetry throughout Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And I've not read those books. Some people like go through the books every year. I've read them once, and they took me a long time. Like I thought that, and I was used to getting through a book in a day or 2, you know, maybe a week if I was like kind of milking it. But like these books, I was like, oh my gosh! So it took me about like 2 months to read these books because they were really thick. But I think you would like him just for the attention to detail and words and culture that he has. And I really like him. So yeah.
Well, I think that it's interesting, especially to read something like that, because, you know, in reality, we see that there are very close ties between environment, culture, language, and
Yeah.
so to see somebody string all of those together, there, for people to feel like it's something that they can take and there's some truth in, because I
Yeah.
mean, really with fiction, if it wasn't based in reality at all, there would be no draw for it. It would just be this
Exactly.
random thing. So
Yeah.
there's got to be something that he's lining up and something he's piecing together that people feel like it's at least reasonable that it could be true.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the attention to detail that he had was so insane that it made people feel like, man, this like really happened. You know, it's just like, and people really liked that. And for me, I think what I really enjoyed was the richness of this, like the actual story. Because I think a lot of times people nowadays they like have all the frills. You know, they'll describe their characters, but they don't really do anything with them. If that makes sense. So I don't know. Have you read a lot of modern fiction at all?
I have. I was kind of forced to in school
Yeah,
in many
yeah.
ways,
We
and
all
there
were.
was some that we read that was decent, and
Yeah.
some that was more classical that I really couldn't appreciate at the time, because it's not that I couldn't, but that nobody explained to me how really to appreciate it.
Yeah.
And but no, we did get a fair amount of modern fiction that I think is very one-dimensional. I think you have a lot of characters that are, they're more or less in the story just as like a symbol of something, but they don't change. There's no growth of the character, and that can start to sour you if the story gets long, because it feels like it's like the same thing over and over.
Yeah, exactly. There's no character arc, and the character just feels so shallow and not real. Like if that was a real person, they would have definitely changed by now, you know. So
Yeah. And I think a good example, by the way, of a book where you do see, and I think that they actually split some characters up, and I don't remember the names exactly, but I think that there are some characters that stay pretty much the same throughout the book, and then other characters you see really intense character arcs.
Yes, yeah.
Did you ever read The Outsiders?
I don't think so. Is it dystopian or is it
No, it was based on, oh geez, I'm trying to go back to like, I think it was 7th grade here that I read
Okay.
this, but it's basically like two rival groups
okay.
that kind of spit and spat with each other, and it gets very intense. Like there's death in the book,
Okay, yeah.
but you do see some characters that are in the story just for the purpose of like being a crutch for the rest of the characters,
Mm-hmm.
and then you see a lot of the main characters really go through an extreme character arc, and a lot of the death is what brings that extremity out of it. So I think that that's just a good example for anybody who's interested in it.
Yeah.
That's a great example of a book that kind of pieces both together, and I think that a lot of books do. It's just that's one that comes to mind as you know, really showing that difference.
Yeah, and I think that that's important to remember too. Like, not all of your characters have to go through like some insane, you know, character arc, but they do need to. There needs to be at least the main characters, you know, because I think a lot of characters are kind of like they have a function within the story, like oh, the mentor, or oh, the, you know what I mean, like that kind of a thing, where they're not necessarily going to be going through a lot of change, but like their circumstances might change, you know, like a lot of times it's, you know, a circumstance happens and then everyone deals with it differently, but there's usually like the wise figure who, you know, is like, oh, kind of under control, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And then there's like the main character who's like, oh my gosh, you know, just everything's falling down, you know, falling apart around them, and they have to figure out how to become stronger throughout the story. But yeah, so I love, I think that classic literature has a lot of strong suits that maybe modern literature doesn't, but I also think modern literature is streamlined enough that people can really get everything. Whereas I think in classic literature, sometimes they were paid by the word. So I don't know, like, have you ever read Les Mis or anything like that? Like any of those really thick books?
No, I haven't, but
Okay.
I have heard of that being paid by the word, and so people really drag things out.
Yeah, like he'll spend like it was Victor Hugo, and he would spend like a whole chapter describing this. He literally spent like I think I read like 50 pages of him doing a description on this building with these nuns inside, and I was like, wow, this must really be important. And then it just skips to where the next character comes in. It was like that whole thing that you just read, not important at all. And I was like, oh, waste of my time. But, you know, so we don't have like that problem anymore. But I think sometimes you get to the opposite, like what you were saying, with not having like good vocabulary, things that really stretch your mind. it's like it's become so simplified sometimes that it's no longer like, it's not really engaging you in your higher mind. You know what I mean?
And I think that that's, and not that you're not saying this, but I think that they're very connected, you know, like simple words, simple mind kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to kind of know, like, what's your favorite style of poetry right now, and what for you creates a poem? Like, what are you, like, in a particular mood, or you have a particular thought? How do you make your poetry?
Well, I think my favorite style of poetry, and I don't know if this is particularly a style, but
Okay.
my favorite type of poetry to read are just like the 2 to 4 line bits of poetry where,
Yeah.
you know, they have to cram this massive idea or concept into just a few words, a few lines, and really make it punch hard.
Yeah.
But I think that one of my favorite poets, and really it goes beyond into even his short stories, is one of my favorite poets is Edgar Allan Poe. And I very much enjoy the way that he sets up different scenery in his poems and the words that he uses, and the way that his symbolism isn't like you would tend to see in modern poetry, where it's very like blatant, and or they sometimes insert symbols for the purpose of trying to make something blatant but veil it as something complex.
Yeah.
And so it's like he's actually tying the symbols into the story, and it's like it's all weaved into one thing rather than like weaving this thing and then stacking things on top that don't really fit, you know? And so I think Edgar Allan Poe is definitely one of my favorites. But I've read quite a few others, and names don't really come to mind off the top of my head, but I did take a poetry course when I was in college, like I told you about the other day, and I had to buy a book for that class that was about that thick.
Yes.
And
this is actually a poetry book right here. I
Oh,
haven't
really?
read it, but it's Lexi's. She gave it to me
Ooh.
from college, so I was like,
Well,
it's apropos.
yeah, it's, I mean, the thing is, when we went through the class, there were a lot of poems that we read that were just really boring and more modern-ish.
Yes.
And they were very superficial and not interesting to me. So I went through the poetry book years. This was like 4 years after I left college. And I was like, wow, there are actually some poems in here from, first of all, older writers that we didn't really read, but there's some really solid poems in here that we just didn't touch on.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why didn't we? And it pains me that we didn't get to talk about these in class. But regardless, I found them after the fact, and I've bookmarked a few of them. And again, like I said, names don't come to mind, but I definitely think that there's a lot out there for people to either find what they like or they don't like. Like, no matter what you like, there's a section of poetry for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in terms of what I think I use to derive my poetry, I think it honestly it comes from a lot of the philosophical thoughts and the philosophical insight, and taking massive concepts. And there's sometimes where I'll write like a paragraph or two on a concept, and then like there will be certain images that come to my mind as I'm writing, and those images can be condensed down. Like they'll take entire like a couple sentences and condense it down to a few words all at once. But it's the kind of thing where it's nice to have the poetic line in tandem with the actual writing, the explanation, the more long form of everything.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of my poetry comes from. It's really from philosophy, and it's from, in part, also just really diving into my own emotions. And, you know, me being an INTJ, it's very difficult to try to get past that wall and get into your feelings.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think that philosophy's helped me recognize that there is a wall there for me, and I need to get beyond it to understand those things if I want to. And I certainly want to. I find value in them. And as I've gotten beyond that wall more and more, it's like the more that you cross over it, you start to sort of you start to lay down like a path. You know, you carve out a path as you're going over the same spot over and over. And that's kind of the place that I've gotten to. So at first, I remember I was amazed when I would write something poetic, and I was like, I didn't think that could come from me. Like, this is the best thing I've written all month. And then it's like the next time I would go and write poetry, which I'll get to that in a second. But the next time I'd go to write poetry, it would come a little bit easier, and then a little bit easier. And I'm at the point now where I can at least get a concept for poetry down, even if I have to come back at a later date and piece it out a little bit more and make it a little bit more specific. But the thing that I was going to come back to is that when I say I'm going to go write poetry, I don't think poetry, it's like if you have an hour every day of free time, it doesn't mean that you have an hour every day to write poetry. It means that you have an hour of, like an hour window every day to hope that you're inspired to write poetry in that hour. It comes to you. You can't call on it. And that's what I find really interesting. And so there are days where there's a park by my house that I go to often to write philosophy, poetry, to read different things, just to be able to think things through. And it's a very open space, but there's a lot of nature. There's a lot of other life there. It's very inspiring. And there are times that I'll go there for 3 or 4 hours, and I'll bang out a lot of poetry and a lot of philosophy, and I'll get really deep into some thoughts and really feel like I've made progress. And then there's other times I go there, and I'll be there for 45 minutes, and I'll be like, okay, this is a waste of my time. Like, there's just nothing coming to me. And you know pretty early on what kind of day it's going to be. I always love the days when you start to really get into something.
Find things on those days when you're feeling inspired. It's like I see this giant thing called the creative cave. You go down in there, and you do not make things. You find things, right? So it's like, when you're mining for gems or whatever, like you go down there with your pickaxe, and like some days you're going to find something that's great, and other days you're like, man, there's nothing in the mine today, So, or you haven't gone down far enough or something. And sometimes other people have like carved a path for you, like, have you ever had a thought and then you'll like see it later on? Like, you're like, man, someone got to it before I did. Like, have you ever had that?
Yes.
Yeah. And you're like, dang it. Or, or like you'll see something and then, like maybe later on you understand what they meant, that kind of a thing. But so I totally get what you're saying, and I hated I had a poetry class this last year, and I hated it when I was like forced to write a poem, because I was like, poems will just come to me very easily. But when someone's like all of a sudden like write a poem, like everything that I know goes out the window. You're like, the cat sat on a big rat.
If somebody's telling you to write poetry, they don't understand how poetry happens.
Yeah, exactly. So I have to almost like, you can't overthink it, Yeah. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about having like a paragraph and then having the poem, and then it's almost like you can go deeper with it. You could have an essay, a paragraph, a line of poetry, a poem, and then like you can even go further with like a song or a dance movement, or there's like so many different ways to translate the same feeling. And
it's really just art.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think it'd be really cool to have like a portfolio of like one idea that is translated like 10 times, so that when you go through it, you're like, man, I really get this now. And not everybody's going to understand everything in the same way, which I think is difficult for people to understand. But like, if you had a portfolio like that, where you had 10, it was like the same concept, but 10 different times in 10 different ways, someone would get it. You know what I mean? And when you're having a high level concept, I think that something like that can be really, really helpful for someone, because people aren't taught to think very deeply nowadays, nor do they have the vocabulary. So sometimes you can't reach them with words until you're like, okay, now I gotta like pull out the dictionary and teach you what this means, and then maybe even the word that they're using to describe that word is a word that they don't know, or a concept that they can't understand. And even some of our phrases that we have, like, you can't have your cake and eat it too, took me forever to actually figure out what that meant. You know what I mean? Like, people throw around phrases, and then, like, later on, like 20 years later, like, oh, now I get it, you know? So I think people say things to each other all the time about politics or about philosophy, and, and they're just parroting what they've heard, or maybe what they think it is, and I hate it when someone, like, uses a word incorrectly over and over again. So, but when you do that, like when you finally get someone to really sit and think about what a word means or what a concept means, and you see like the light bulb go off in their eyes, you're like, oh, I have done my job, So, do you want to go over your poem now, or?
Yeah. I mean, if there were specific lines that you were curious about, or different things that you wanted to dive into, by all means.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to know how your poetry is meant to be read.
Okay. What exactly?
Like, I mean, like, how do you say it out loud? Like, how do you pause over your words? Like you have all these indentations, which I really liked. So I'm actually gonna show you guys this really quick. So, are you okay with me doing this?
Yeah.
Okay,
Go
okay.
ahead.
So there's all these different indentations, which a lot of times people will bring all the lines over to this side. But with poetry, and you guys might not know this if you're not like particularly a poet, but when you have your punctuation is really important, because if you have a line with neither commas nor periods, you don't know when to take a breath. So you're just reading, you're like 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1, and has that consistent
And
rhythm.
I think it equalizes all the lines too.
Yeah,
whereas
exactly.
all the lines in real poetry, they're not all equal.
Yeah.
It's like they're some are meant to play on other concepts that you put in previous lines, and that's kind of how I've spaced this here. Like even those 4 colons in a row, it's like that's supposed to delineate that first section from the rest.
That's what I was wondering. I was like, I want to know about this. You know, and if you're a musician, think about like when you are reading sheet music, how there's like breaths and pauses, right? So you have like the hold on the note, and then you're like half a breath, or that's how it is with punctuation. And I think poetry is the preface to music. It's the preface to song, right? It's like we took a thought, we said a lot of things in our head, and then we made it have some sort of rhythm. And then from this kind of rhythm could come lyrics and music. Does that make sense?
What's really interesting about that is one thing that Friedrich Nietzsche talks about is the difference between Apollonian and Dionysian art.
Okay.
And basically what Dionysian art is something that invigorates the whole body. It brings the whole body into movement. And he said that music is the closest, music is the most Dionysian art form that there is.
Yeah.
And I think that that's interesting because poetry can be very Apollonian in many ways.
Yeah.
And I think that to then translate that to Dionysian, I think calling poetry a precursor of music, or many forms of art a precursor of music, is very true. I think it's true beyond what people would normally think of it if they didn't, understand the different kinds of art and what it does to the body.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why that is why Shakespeare, like, I'm not a Shakespeare worshiper.
Oh, I'm not either. I think he was a comedian without trying to be.
Exactly. I know. Everyone's like, oh, the great Shakespeare. I'm like, I'm actually not. But what's interesting about Shakespeare is that he did have that iambic pentameter. So everything kind of sings and has a rhythm to it. And so just because of that, I think some of his stuff sticks with people a little bit more. Like when you hear it spoken out loud, it has a specific rhythm. And so it's not that all poetry, like people are like, well, what is poetry? Is it a rhyme? I'm like, well, no, because like you can have absolutely non-rhyming poetry.
Oh yeah,
right?
I'm sure you've gotten back through this. Like, a lot of it doesn't rhyme.
Yeah, and it's not about the rhyme, and not even necessarily, I think good poetry will start to sing on its own. You know what I mean? Like a lot of my poetry, it'll have internal rhymes. So it'll be like, if I take an I vowel at the middle of a line, I'll rhyme with another one, even just non-intentionally, and then all of a sudden I'll look back and I'll go. But even if it's just kind of something that's short and pithy, or even if you're just arranging words in a certain way, it should have something that makes it stick with you when you walk away from it. It should have a staying power that a song does, even if it's, you know what I'm talking about? Because we all remember things in song. That's like when you have to memorize something for school, Did you ever have to, like, memorize the periodic table of elements or anything? I sang it,
That's
all I'm going to memorize.
The Looney Tunes have that song of all the countries.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So those will stick with you, right? So, but that's kind of what poetry does, but I think for higher level concepts. And I think there's some other poems that, like, there's poetry that is for high-level concepts, and then there's also poetry for, like, a moment. Like when you walk into a room and, like, the light is a certain way and the curtain sways, and you're like, it's a moment that you can't take a picture or a video of, right? Because it affects you a certain way. So then you're like, oh, okay, well, then I'm going to write a poem about it, So there's that kind of poetry, too. So I think it's all very, but it's about making something stick and stay. So, but, do you want me to read this? I'm very particular about, like, I don't like to read my own poetry, but if someone asks me to, I will. So do you want me to read it, or do you want
Yes,
to
you
read
can.
it?
You can.
Okay.
You can read it by all means.
Okay. So, and then I want you to tell me if I'm reading it the way that it sounds in your head.
Actually, you know what? I'll read it and I'll explain it
Okay.
as I go. As I go here.
Okay. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. So the beginning section of this poem, it was meant to set up the basis for the entire book that I'm working on.
Okay.
Which was basically my realization that a lot of what I was doing in life and a lot of the things that were more of my demons and things that I saw as holding me back were things that were imposed on me, not things that were either naturally occurring or things that I took on myself.
Okay.
And
yeah.
so you know, they say that to feel like you need to get somewhere new, you have to feel like you need to burn away something to build something new. Mm-hmm. Like you know, you have to feel a stress that pushes you to change. And so I think that's what the beginning of this poem is talking about when it says, as sorrow wafts over the tides of my life, it becomes rather apparent that invisible hands need my current. Basically saying that the ebb and flow of my life was something that I wasn't in control of at the time, and that was making me feel a certain way, but it didn't belong to me. It was, and that's why the next line is, but the sorrow does not belong to me. It's not my sorrow, it's something that's imposed. And then I'm merely a harbinger for those who will learn the life that has sprouted these lines. Basically saying that from this point onward, from not just the poem, but the whole rest of the book, it's like I'm trying to act as a warning for people who were in the situation that I was in, and I want people to really learn my life that brought these lines into being and has put them on the page, because there's a lot to them.
Yeah.
And so that little section there, you could almost take that out of the whole poem and still read it with some coherence.
Yeah.
But I think that it sets up not just the poem well, but the rest of the book. But it does set up the poem itself pretty well too.
Yeah.
So then it goes into the real first stanza of the poem there. Supple flesh and will of beast war behind my eyes. No gentle hand eddies me to cover as shells trace my shadow. Basically saying that, you know, the beast of man tries to become something else, and when the beast of man is trying to become something, he has to war with his supple flesh. He has to war with his limitations, the things that hold him back.
Yeah.
And it's that supple flesh that other beasts take advantage of, that they sink their teeth into, and they can rip you to shreds if you're not careful about it. And when I say no gentle hand eddies me to cover as shells trace my shadow, it's basically saying that whether you think somebody is in your corner or not, they might not be in your corner no matter what. Even if they purport to be, they might not be. Yeah. And as shells trace my shadow is basically saying that, like, the shells are coming down on me and there's nobody else around me, and I have to realize that, because that realization that you're on your own in a certain way to a certain degree, it's like that has to be taken to heart, because that's the beginning of the journey to everything else.
No one is going to rescue you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why I get to a line later on That's why I get to the line later on that says, what outstretched hand does not wish to swath my very neck and bequeath my withered corpse to soil? Basically saying that you find people in your life that will tell you that they're trying to help you.
Yeah.
They'll tell you that they're on your side, but they wouldn't be on your side if they didn't find a value in being on your side, if they didn't see some reason to draw themselves to you. And so it's like, if you take that purpose away from them for them going to you, they wouldn't hesitate to, well, swath my very neck and bequeath my withered corpse to soil.
Yeah.
It's like they would run over you to get to what they want, even if they don't realize it. And I think that this goes into my own personal philosophy a little bit, where I think that people are always doing what they most want. And that doesn't mean that you always get what you want or you're always doing something enjoyable.
Yeah.
But you know, it's like if you hate your job, you show up for your job because not getting a paycheck is worse than showing up for your job.
Yeah.
And so I think it's along the same lines where it's like people don't always recognize the purpose of what they're doing. They don't always recognize their own motives.
Yeah.
And so they might think that they're trying to help you, and really they're trying to tear you down to build themselves up.
Yeah. That's
And-
very true for a lot of people. Very true. Yeah. Yeah.
So was there anything in particular that you that you had a question on, or that you found particularly interesting?
Well, so first of all, so when you were talking about the shells, I was literally picturing shells on the beach. So I was like, so what, it was interesting to hear you read it. That's why and explain it, because I was like, I mean, it was a beautiful picture, but I was literally seeing like someone laying on the ground with like shells around them. You know what I mean?
Oh, okay,
So,
I see.
Yeah. So that was interesting to hear you explain that.
Okay, yeah, no, I meant shells more like in
Bomb
war
shells.
when
Yeah.
bomb shells, like
Yeah.
when there's shelling happening.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, so these two pieces here.
Yes.
So, yeah, you know what's also really interesting is like, this is kind of silly, but like when like it talks about in the Bible about how like there's a cloud of witnesses that are watching us, you know, like, and they're like all the people that have gone before us, and they're cheering you on. And so I remember sometimes like when you were talking about just like what, you know, doing what you most want, even if it's not something that you really want to do. I remember like there would be times when I would be, because I spent a lot of my life cleaning after my siblings and just all that kind of stuff. And there would be times where I would just be like, I don't want to do this. And then I thought about like, well, you know, like nobody else is watching this right now, but they're watching this right now. You know, like that's what I believe. And so I was like, that became like my motivation to do what I needed to do, is because like, well, I actually do have people watching my life like it's some kind of reality TV show, so I gotta do what I need to do, you know. But yeah, it's interesting because like that helped me, like even when things on earth weren't going my way, or even if I got nothing out of anything, like nothing out of loving someone, nothing out of, you know, anything, like that was what was driving me. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, yeah. But so anyway, I would love to hear these two, like this and this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, what I'm talking about, I was trying to separate the two different realms of what I see as being the physical world, and then more of like the spiritual world kind of place. And I started with the spiritual world because that's where I think a lot of people go when they try to give you help in some way.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of people, as I'm sure that you've experienced, a lot of people try to suck you into their spiritual world, not help you find your own. And so that's why, you know, I talk about like the engorged bellies that walk in cavernous, ichor-soaked footsteps. And so one thing that is probably important to note, just for definition's purpose, there is ichor was the blood of the gods in ancient Greece.
Okay, like Icarus, like.
I don't know if it's related to that.
Okay.
I don't know if it's related to that, but it was basically the blood of the gods.
Okay.
So it's basically saying that the footsteps that humanity's left are very deep, because people over time have I think the majority of people, the vast majority, you know how like most people are like, more people are followers rather than leaders, and that's just gotten more and more disparate over time.
Yeah.
Well, I think that it's this line of cavernous, ichor-soaked footsteps kind of alludes to that a bit, where it's like the footsteps that man is taking are very deep, and it's hard to climb out of them because they've been walked over so many times.
Yeah.
But they're soaked in the blood of man's God, not an actual higher power. And so when I say, what has cuffed my wrist to a gravedigger's shovel, doomed to resurface our mutilated and putrefied God, basically what I'm saying is, why do people feel like they have to cuff my wrist to a shovel to dig up the God that they want me to dig up, to find the God that they want me to find? And I say that I reject this, for in reviving God, we bury ourselves. Basically, by digging the hole and pulling somebody else's God or man's God back up to the surface, we're burying ourselves in the hole. It's like shoveling and throwing the dirt on top of yourself, and you're eventually covered, but their God is now free to rule.
Okay, yeah.
And he's taking control of you. So that's why I start that whole stanza with wrath of the heavens, because that's really how I view it, is that it's this man's view of heaven, and it's the wrath that's coming down from that. And then when I get into the human aspect of it, fallible humanness into which I fall, basically it goes into the idea that people are trying to, in many instances, I don't think everybody is, but I think in many instances, they're trying to push their views on you rather than help you find what your views are.
Yeah.
And so that was what, what outstretched hand does not wish to swath my very neck and bequeath my withered corpse to soil. I think that was kind of the idea, was you start to feel alone, you start to feel lost, because it's like everybody is trying to drag me down so that they can rise up. And then when I say, what lungs breathe into my own, depriving me of all that is fresh and earthly, I reject this, for it is not life. Basically, the words that I speak, it comes from the air in your lungs. But you have to be careful that somebody else isn't breathing that air into you.
Yeah.
You have to find that air for yourself. It has to be a fresh breath of air.
Yeah.
And I think that when that happens, when somebody else is breathing into your lungs, it removes you from this earthly life, and it brings you to some more heavenly realm. And I think it basically, it removes you from your person. It removes you from being who you are on this earth, and it drags you into this other realm that takes you away from everything that you are. And when I say I reject this, for it is not life, it's saying that, when people try to push their views on you, they're doing it with the intention of telling you, this is life. This is, I found the answer. This is what it is.
Yeah.
But you have to reject that, because it's their view of what it is, not you finding what life is to you. And it doesn't mean that there aren't commonalities.
Yeah.
But there are certainly a large proportion of that is people simply trying to stamp you with their imprint.
Yeah.
And so I reject this, for in reviving God we bury ourselves. I think that that's what happens when people try to push their view of a God on other people, is that it's like them trying to revive their internal God by burying you.
Yeah.
And when I say I reject this, for it is not life, it is just saying, I think that people, when you look at how fallible people are, that's not, there are a lot of people that their fallibleness is eating them alive, and it's taking them from the beauty of life. It's making them a reaction medium in a lot of ways. They become just it's almost like an algorithm that just reacts to things. They're not a creator. They're not like a wheel rolling out of itself. They're not, they don't have the inquisitive mind of a child.
It's like people who've been programmed politically. You know what I mean? Like when you just get the pat answers every time. So yeah, and it's interesting because and I'm not knowing where your thinking is right now on all of this, but it's so interesting because one of the things that I really feel passionately about now is presenting information to people, but letting them choose about things. You know what I mean? Because it's and also I truly do believe that there is a God, but I believe that He can intervene in His own way to people. You know what I mean? I don't think that I need to, what you were saying about it's that's why people don't like it when people are cramming things down someone's throat. You know what I mean? But also as a teacher, you're responsible to teach what you at least believe to be true, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what you do too. It's everyone has to do that. You know what I mean? Everyone has to be this is what I believe is true. Yeah. And
it's
then,
it is my belief that this is what's happening.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that's what you have to do. You have to, and then I think the problem now with the whole idea of rejecting absolute truth is that we're left in this kind of endless spiral, which I think some people find maybe inspiring, but like for me, for my soul, I'm like, I want something that's solid. You know what I mean? So like that's what I've always searched for, is things that are solid. But like when like if other people don't want that, like I'll present my information and my resources and whatever. But like it's not the same as like someone who's going door to door and like banging in the door and being like, have you heard about what I have to, you know what I mean? Like, and like trying to, it's like trying to, and I don't even like, I don't like the term sales either, because it's like, I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm trying to present what I believe to be true. Like if you think that there's a fire in someone's house and you don't go warn them about that, that's on you. You know what I mean? And you might be wrong about the fire. You know what I mean? But if you really think that your neighbor's house is going to burn down, and you're like, whatever. You know what I mean? Then it's wrong of you to do that, right?
Yeah.
But and I think that's the same thing that what you're doing here too. It's like, if you believe that there's a fire somewhere, you as like a person who's trying to go and do something that's right, or do something that's good, or do something that's well, you have to go to that spot. And maybe we're wrong about the fire, but you have to at least call attention to something. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think one of the points that you're getting at is that a lot of the time that people look out into the world and they try to make sense of it, they start with like the outer wisps of reality. They start with a conclusion and then try to justify that conclusion by walking back.
Yeah.
Rather than starting at the foundation, the trunk of the tree, their life. Like, what is the purpose of them being here?
Yeah.
And then move outward from there. So like they'll start with, trying to define something like truth at the outset, rather than walk to it from the solid foundation of the base of the tree. And in Friedrich Nietzsche's book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's actually a very interesting segment of that, where Zarathustra goes to talk to a man who's at the base of a tree on a hill.
Okay.
And he basically walks through that idea that people are so tempted to start at the outer wisps of the tree, the piece that's the least solid, and then they try to walk backwards, rather than starting at the base and building themselves out. And I think that's I think it's because it's easier in many ways to start at that outer wisp, because you don't have to put in work to draw a conclusion out of nothing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of people, they don't spend enough time thinking about anything to make their own conclusions about anything. You know what I mean? Like we were talking about just like how much we have thought the other day. I was like, and I think we've just spent a lot of time thinking, you know what I mean? Like I've been pretty aware of my own thoughts since I was about like 3. Like I have very strong memories of that time, and like I was able to talk really early, and so it was just like I was nonstop thinking. And then I've thought thoughts, that have very young, and then I would talk to someone who was quite a bit older than me, and they'd be like, I haven't even thought of that yet. And I'm like, really? It's like, that scares me, because I'm like a little kid, you know what I mean? But yeah, so to be questioning life, like why, that was always one, so why, and you have to get to the point, and I got to a point where a few years ago where I was just like, you know what, if there's no, like, I have to ask why until I really know, because otherwise there's not a reason for me to get up in the morning. There isn't, right? It's like, you know what I mean? So it's, you have to, and that has to be, like, that's why I say every soul takes its turning. And I really do, like, I believe that there is absolute truth. I absolutely do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I wouldn't be saying what I'm saying,
No, I do agree.
Yeah.
I do agree.
But I think that, like, every person has to arrive at that spot for themselves. And I think that other people, like, I think that God will send, this is my belief, but I believe that God will always send, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And, like, it could even just be life circumstances that all of a sudden, like, you're like, whoa, like, nothing has ever, like, struck me like this, right? And then all of a sudden you're seeing things differently. But that doesn't have anything to do with somebody yelling at you from a pulpit, or like going to a Buddhist monastery, or it doesn't have anything to do with that. It has something to do with, like, if there really is an outside force that is God, that force is much stronger than a little person, and he doesn't necessarily need your help. It's like God could reach whoever he wants to on his own, but he might use other people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, that's why I'm like, I mean, I'll do what he asks me to do, but it's not like God's like, oh, I really need your help, Ashley. Because he can like, boom, do whatever he wants to do, you know.
Yeah. I think that's where you see a lot of the difference between like a leader and a ruler, where you know, a leader, you have to have people who want to follow you if you're a leader, but a ruler can force people to follow them.
Yeah, a tyrant, tyrant. Yes. And I don't like tyrants.
No. Anybody who watches my channel, you know that I don't like tyrants either.
No to tyrants. Yeah, no. So did you have any particular lines? Did you want to go? Is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
Well, I'll cover the basics of these last two stanzas here. So everything up to this point, which I've pretty much read out all the way through. Yeah. It basically sets up everything that it took for me to realize that to really start to build myself into something that was stronger and a creator on its own, I had to recognize all of these different realities.
Yeah.
And in recognizing these realities, it's not like it's painless. It's not like it's like you're glad to figure these things out.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why the poem is called Abandoned.
Yeah.
Because this stanza starts with abandoned, but finally isolation. Finally, you're alone. Finally, you are yourself. And I think that that's really like it's really the start of like you're going over. It's the start of crossing the bridge between the animal and being the fullest version that you could be of yourself.
Yes.
And so that's what this is kind of getting at, is where you reject a lot of the man-made fictions that you see as controlling you, but until you really piece them out, you don't know that they're controlling you.
Yeah.
And so once you recognize they're controlling you and you get rid of them, you cut them out, which is not easy. That's painful. It burns. You're burning away.
Yes. Yeah.
Things that are not helping you. Things that are dragging you down, making you sick. Because one question I think a lot of people have to ask for the beast of man is how do you tame a beast? You make him sick. And I think that's what happens in a lot of cases, is people impart their views themselves onto somebody else, and it makes the other person's spirit sick.
Yeah.
But it tames them. It brings them into the realm that the other person, it's like the Overton window that the other person wants them to be in. And so that's kind of the view of the second to last stanza here. And then the last one is, now that you're alone, where do you go from here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's knowing that, you know, the sun is going to rise tomorrow, and we are made to thrive on this planet. We're made to thrive in this environment.
Yeah.
We are the product of a higher power.
Yeah.
And that is not a mistake. That is something that we should be taking with absolute gratitude and with all of our being. And so then you start to go after the people. You have to go after the people who are chaining people to themselves, who are burying people, who are harming humanity, whether they recognize it or not.
Exactly.
And I think that's a very important thing. And I think this poem sets up the rest of the book to now move forward and say, okay, now that we know we have to move forward on our own for who we are, how do we do it? And how do we combat, and really, how do we go to war against these people who are pushing themselves on others and who are dragging humanity down as a whole, who are turning humanity from this living being into this reaction medium blob?
Yeah. Wow. This makes me think of not the band, but like just the concept of Raging Against the Machine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I like, what I hate is systems. I don't like systems. I think that like I have this concept of like the wildflower people. And if you think about like wildflowers, they grow everywhere. There's always an abundance of them. There's nobody like there to control them, or you know what I mean? It's just like free and open. You know what I mean? Idea. But it's also not chaotic. Like there's nothing chaotic about a wildflower, right? And like you can have like, there is sort of beauty in having like a really well manicured garden, but it's not, there's no like, there's nothing that's really organic about it, right? So like if you go to an HOA neighborhood and everything is like just so, but it's like almost too just so, you know what I mean? And like people like become, they're like they become OCD, right? And it's like this just like overly perfect, and you feel like you can't breathe there. I feel like that's how a lot of people get, whether they are like obsessed with work, or obsessed with like their own purity, or obsessed with like money, or you know what I mean, like when you get obsessed with one thing too much, it's not good. So like when you pull yourself out of any system, like how can you destroy someone who isn't in the system? You can't, unless you kill them, right? But that's it. Like that's the only way to destroy that which cannot be in a system. But if there's one free person and they die in love and peace, like that's why a lot of really good leaders, they die, it's like tragic deaths, but they'll die in peace and love, and then their message ends up spreading. You know what I mean? Because you cannot kill true freedom. And like you'll see different political leaders or religious leaders or whatever, when bad ones die, nobody cares. You know what I mean? It's like just everyone's like woohoo, you know, because the system has died. But when someone who is a really good leader, or when someone has a true grasp on God, when they die, it's like everything just kind of like it starts popping up everywhere, and it can't be controlled, right? Because it's like wildfire or wildflowers. It just spreads and spreads and spreads, you know. So.
And I think too that when you have a bad ruler that dies, I think that it's almost like, I think it goes to the idea that God loves everybody equally, where it's like, it doesn't mean that there isn't distance between people, but in the realm of really life itself, everybody is equal in the sense that the stresses are just as important as the pieces that flourish. And so this is an instance where the alcoholic in the gutter is just as important as Jeff Bezos. In our limited human realm, they're very different. There's a massive distance between them. But I think that it kind of plays into the idea of order, like total order and total chaos, both being wasteful. Exactly. So it's like if you have total chaos, things are just going to veer into dysfunction and die, because there is no truth. There's no set path. And total order is wasteful because there is no ability to correct yourself to the right path. It's like and I know that you understand this, but just you know, emphasizing this point, it's like if you had a rod that was a mile long, and you're trying to hit a dime a mile away with that pole. If you're off by an inch 10 feet from you, you're off by several feet when you get to that mile, when you get to that dime. And it's that kind of idea.
Okay, I gotta show you something really quick.
Okay.
I was like, oh my gosh. Okay, so I've had this symbol that I've made, which to me represents like going from like kind of dark to light, and there's like a perfect path, but we can't go on the perfect path, so you'll like kind of deviate, and then but you always end up, like if you're meant to go to the right path, you'll always end up there. So this is the symbol. When you were talking about that, I was like, man, okay. So so this is it. All right, hey guys, so it's the next day. So as soon as I was going to show my picture, it died. So I was just showing Ben because you were talking about like the path. Do you remember that?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So this is kind of like my symbol that I've had this for a couple of years, but this is like the darkness and then like the path that we need to go on to get to the light, but none of us can actually get there. So it's this idea of like, this is kind of the curve. I just wanted to thank you, Ben, for coming on my channel. And did you have any like closing thoughts about anything?
Not really, no. I really enjoyed our discussion. I thought that it was very productive. I think that there's a lot that people can learn from it that isn't necessarily intuitive. So I'm glad that we got to discuss it.
Me too. And then if anybody has like questions or anything, you guys can leave those in the comments. And I would love to have you back on if that is something that you'd like to do. Because I think we would like to continue the conversation. So if you guys have topics that you think would be interesting for us to talk about, I think education in general would be kind of a good one. So yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you.